He has also served as consultant at National Institute of Educational Planning and Administration, Delhi. He has been recipient of Global University Program Scholarship from East Board, an international organization with a special status to the United Nations. And our next discussant is Aditya. He is pursuing PhD at Department of Political Science, University of Delhi. His research area focuses on the framework of populism. Populism to understand the electoral shift of subaltern group towards right-wing populism parties in India. So on that note, we are starting this session. So before we begin, I would like to outline the format of the session. The author will be speaking for 25 to 30 minutes, and that will be followed by each discussant having time 25 to 30 minutes, 25 to 20 minutes, 30 minutes, and then we will have a response from the author, and finally we will have a Q&A session. We don't have chair. Professor Nivedita Menon was about to chair this session, but we don't have chair. So all can say that author can the discussion panel can manage things. Professor Prakash will be chairing this session on behalf of us. Thank you.
Should I start?
Yeah.
So, should I go there and speak?
Hello. Yes. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
I'm sure you can because I'm quite loud usually.
Okay. Thank you so much. And of course, it's a bit of a pity that we are a truncated panel today, but that's fine. I think given the kind of weather in Delhi right now, and which is why Nivedita couldn't finally make it, right? So she had set out, and then because the roads are completely flooded, and she comes from this Yamuna side, right? So which is completely flooded, so she had to return. So just in case there are people who've come here to just listen to Nivedita, I think there will be more occasion for that, and of course, you are here in JMI. So, I'm glad that we are here to talk about not just the book, but also by using the book as an excuse, right? So to talk about the Indian University. And I know some of my colleagues here are coming from a GBM, right? So Teachers Association GBM in JNU that's happening, the JNU TA GBM that's happening right now, right? So which is about the summary dismissal, termination of a colleague in the Center for Political Studies. So that gives you a sense of the immediate kind of conjuncture within which we are here to talk about the Indian University, where professors, right, where students, as we all know, I have several of my students from Jamia sitting here, right, and we come with an experience where 17 students of Jamia had been suspended, right, for daring to remember, right, so the anti-CA moment in December last year. Right, so where 17 students were not just suspended, their pictures were then, right, so their pictures, their phone numbers, their addresses, their details were all flashed on the gates of Jamia. So that's how, right, the students are dealt with in the Indian University today. And we've just come to a university where there's a Teachers Association GBM happening about the summary dismissal of a teacher, right, so on excuses of unauthorized absence, right? So that's the kind of state of affairs that we are addressing here. But before I get into the talk about the Indian University, which is a talk that we are all living in a way, right? So what we talk about here today is probably the life that we live, or probably that the life that we want to live but never quite get to live, right? So in the university. But before I get there, right, so I think I should begin by thanking JNU Academic, right, so, and thanking JNU Academic not for this event, but for every other event that they keep doing, right, so, and the series of discussions and book discussions that they are doing relentlessly and insistently to keep up this kind of a space of conversation, to keep alive this spirit of a conversation behind the very idea of a university. I think that's fantastic to have a body like JNU Academic. So it's my heartfelt gratitude and deep solidarity with, right, so everybody who's running and who's part of JNU Academic for bringing us back within the university out to the very object of the book, as it were, right? So, and in a sense, right, so it's ironical, right, for us to say that for bringing us back to the book within the university, but the state of the university is such today in India, where we are almost forced on a daily basis to do work outside of the book, as it were. Right, so where we are constantly forced to control the damage that is happening to the world and to our own lives outside of the world of the book, as it were. So for a platform like JNU Academic to kind of bring about that confluence of what one can call politics and poesis, right? So for them to bring the polis to bear on the poetics of what we do here at the university is absolutely salutary, and I have to begin with a note of gratitude, right, for the work that JNU Academic is doing. Thank you so much for not just this, but for everything else that you've been doing. So having said that, and then I had initially thought that I'd speak for about 15 minutes, but now I think we've got the extra time to ourselves as well. So, but I'll still try and be brief. But because I think I've brought about or I've kind of tried bringing the conversation through, and thanks to JNU Academic, to the object of the book, I think that takes us to an anecdote that I also want to begin with, right? So, an anecdote which, of course, the other day I was listening to Nivedita's speech at a public meeting here in JNU, where she went out and said, and this was a public meeting on Palestine, right? So where she told us, and terrifically so, right? So the way Nivedita does all the time, she said that till the time they can bear their flag on their shoulders, which they are anyway doing, it is for us to bear that flag. It is for us to bear the flag of Palestine. And how do we bear the flag of Palestine? By telling their stories, by talking about them, by remembering them, and by probably trying to cull these little stories that otherwise would have either stayed on our phone screens or probably would have just passed into oblivion. So I want to begin by relating the work that we are doing here, thanks to JNU Academic, with the very form and the object of the book, to what is happening to the book in, let's say, Gaza, right? So, and that, I think, is pretty much the limits of what is happening to the university across the world, right? We here, right, of course, see a certain kind of aesthetic of disappearance of the Indian university. But that aesthetic of disappearance works through suspensions and terminations. That aesthetic of appearance works through forms of structural violence and, of course, forms of physical violence as well, right? So, but there is a certain kind of a spectacular disappearance of the university that's happened in Gaza, right? So, and I want to name this one particular student, right? So who happens to be a fourth-year IT student at the Islamic University in Gaza, right? So somebody called Haya Adil Agha, and she studies at the Department of Science, studied at the Department of Science and Technology at the Islamic University in Gaza, and in a video footage, right? So she talks about her university being turned into rubble, and that's not the end of it. Right? So she says the university, and I'm quoting her, right? So in translation, the university, the place where I used to dream, where I spent 2 years of my life, the best 2 years of my life, was gone, right? And then one of her family members from the tent where she's currently being displaced into, she's been displaced some 13 times since the start of the genocide, right? So one of her family members says that our dreams and everything else we ever wanted was destroyed with our homes. The university used to be a place for the youth to study and pursue their dreams. Now we have started to dream about the simplest of things, just to eat. The dreams of our children have become as basic as filling a bottle of water. They dream of reaching a soup kitchen, right? So I think this is what one of Haya's family member says on the video, and then Haya joins in and Haya says, people have been forced to burn books. Firstly, there's no gas. The occupation has stopped gas from entering Gaza, but people still have to fulfill their daily needs. There's no gas, but people still need to cook and heat water. People can't afford to buy wood or paper, so in the end, they've been forced to burn the university library books. So that is the story of what I've called the aesthetic of disappearance, right? And the aesthetic of disappearance around the university. So the university can successively disappear as we see it happening here, right? And a story of which I also string together in the book itself, right? So how the university, through its successive stages in history, finally becomes but a platform, right? And that's the story that I try and tell in the book, right? In the age of NEP 2020, how the university is abbreviated into, let's say, the academic bank of credits, and finally turned into just a platform. The university becomes almost a phone app, right? So that's one form of disappearance, where the physical body of the student and the physical body of the teacher can then be made redundant to the fact of the university's existence by turning it into, let's say, an app of shared trading, right? Where you can, and I believe a lot of you would be aware that as per the ABC regulations, the Academic Bank of Credit Regulations 2021, a student is only expected to credit 50% of the courses from the institution where he or she enrolls. And the remaining 50% can be traded from anywhere, right? So which is what they call the anytime, anywhere, any level learning, right? Sitting anywhere, one can just buy shares from different universities and complete one's course worth of credits. So that's one kind of disappearance of the university, right? Where the university is abbreviated into a phone app or a digital platform. And then there is the other kind of disappearance of the university, which is happening in Gaza, where the university library book has to be burnt in order to even live a day longer, right? And that, I wanted to set out that context before we start talking about the university and the ideals, the rather vaunted ideals that the university comes with, right? So before we actually get into a discussion of the idea of the university, it's important to remember what is happening to the fact of it. And the fact of it is what I wanted to lay out before we return to the book. Now, this book, I think I would be more interested in hearing what others have to say about the book, people on the panel and people who I'm really, really glad and grateful to for having agreed to talk about the book and for having read the book, right? So, and so I must thank Brahma, I must thank Chetna, and I must thank Aditya for having taken on themselves, right, so the task of reading this and for commenting on my work. But to just put in a nutshell, right, in a very, very short overviewish format, right, why I felt the need to write a book like this, I will just take up the subtitle of the book and probably try and explain the rationale behind the writing of the book through its subtitle. I call this book The Indian University, a Critical History, and not just a history. What I claim to be doing here, I'm not sure whether I've succeeded in the claim, and I would wait to know from my colleagues, right, how much of that claim really has been lived up to. But what I claim to do here is not a history of the university. What I claim to do here is a critical history of the Indian university. Now, what do I mean by a critical history? For me, and at least in this book, the Indianness of the Indian university cannot be understood through recourse to past examples, whether distant or immediate, right? So neither the great ancient Indian University of Nalanda Takshila lore, nor the liberal metropolitan university of a colonial or a later Nehruvian legacy can account for the Indianness of the Indian university. That is what I begin by contending in this book. Because the idea of the university itself, I go out and chart historically, is a lone concept. And I do show this at some length by archivally discrediting the university heritage talk around the Brahminical ashram settlements in Takshila, or the Buddhist Sangharam structure, right, which basically meant a range retreat where the Sangha, right, so the Buddhist Sangha could come and receive aram, right, is what the Sangharam was all about. Right, so the Sangharam structure, range retreat of Nalanda, Vallabhi, Vikramshila or Udampuri. So if neither origin myths from pre-colonial ancient folklore nor success stories in experimental institution building from post-colonial history can provide a cue to what makes the Indian university truly Indian, where must we look for a history of the Indian university? That is the question that I try beginning with. It is here that I pitch the need and the call for a critical history, as one that sets out by imagining the university as the site of its own critique. A critical history is one which questions the deliberate slippage between, or the deliberate confusing of, or the confounding of, the physical fact of an institution with the philosophical force of an idea, where fact becomes the idea, as it were. I set out on my project, therefore, by staging what I call a counterfactual question, right? I begin by staging a counterfactual question, which I believe is the indispensable crutch for a critical history. And what is this counterfactual question? The counterfactual question that I try asking in this book is, what if there is no Indian university? What if there is no idea of an Indian university? What if there is no neat totality of a thinkable or a believable concept called the Indian university? What then remains is only the material instance, or in other words, the physical infrastructures of individual universities. But is that it? Must a history of the Indian university necessarily be a hagiographic account? Right? A hagiographic account of great institutions and little institutions, of central universities and state universities, of colonial examples and post-colonial experiments, of liberal universities and technical institutes. If we have to steer clear of a story of pure and prior origins, as is done often through references to Nalanda, Takshila, Vallabhi, Vikramshila, right? If we have to steer clear of that kind of a nationalist distortion of the archives of history, then must we necessarily engage in hagiographies? Right? So must we engage in hagiographies of separate institutions? Now the book tries to say very resolutely that no. Right? Now, the book tries to say that the only history of the Indian university that remains for us in that case, and that remains for us to recount and to write about, consists in examining what I call the fraught encounters between the university and public, right? Between the university and its conditions of publicness. The category of publicness is what I contend in the book really gives an Indian character to the Indian university. It is the Indian publics, right, who this Indian university finally has to contend with, finally has to negotiate with, that has ever given it anything called an Indian character. And what is the nature of that publicness, of the Indian public university, is what I try and question through this book. So I suggest in this book that the question to ask is not what is the Indian university, but who historically has had the right to the Indian university. Which publics constitute and are conscripted by the Indian university. Who are these publics? That precisely is what I tried to tell here. The history of the publicness of the Indian university. And in doing this historical survey of the relationship between universities and publics, I argue that the story that emerges is not a story of freedom, as we are often made to believe in liberal accounts or even in left of liberal accounts, that the story of the university, right, so the story of the modern university is a story of freedom, right, or the story of the quest for freedom. The concept of freedom, when it applies to the university, is again given different terms, different coinages, right? So, of course, in the Indian case, I can probably end with this. In the Indian case, we've never had a code of academic freedom, right? So, historically speaking, right? So, in the entire policy archive around the Indian university, we've never had a code on academic freedom. The only thing that the Indian university has historically ever had, and which has often been very mistakenly confounded with academic freedom, is autonomy, is what is called a structural autonomy, right? But autonomy is not freedom, right? Now, what I try and survey in this book, right, by looking at the history of the relationship between universities and publics, is precisely the fact that what emerges from this story is, as I said, not a story of freedom, but a story of fear. Contrary to the liberal tale of the secular metropolitan university, as a site of potential promise and emancipation, what haunts the university through its entire history in India, all the way up to the NEP 2020 and the figure of the university as we have it now, the fact of the university as we have it now, is a deep fear, a threat of the meanings of publicness. And I historically go out and chart the sources of this fear. First, I say, is the fear of caste, and second is the fear of religion, both of which I try and survey through the 19th and the early 20th centuries, right? So go out and turn the university into a bastion of the private life of the mind, right? So it is the fear of the public that historically, right, and the history is what brings in the questions, right, so the specters of caste and religion, and I go out and try showing that it is this fear of publicness that finally turns the university into the privileged resort or the privileged bastion, the privileged refuge of a private life of the mind, right? And I try and survey this, just to give you a background, right? So I try and survey this through the 19th and the early 20th centuries, right? So in the 19th century, again, if one has to go out and signpost it, right? So from the amendment in the companies, in the East India Company's Charter in 1813, all the way down to the 1904 Indian Universities Act, which is what comes up and first proposes the university as a teaching institution, as a residential teaching institution. Till then, the Indian university was supposed to be just examining bodies, right, and not teaching institutions, because teaching happened in the colleges, right. So it is in 1904 that the Indian university is first imagined or thought of as a teaching and a residential kind of body, as a residential space. Now, through this entire history from the early 19th to the early 20th century, I try and show how in the allocation of public monies and public monies by the colonial state to the cause of higher education, what comes through is a fear of potential caste mobility, right? The corrupting touch of the caste-marked body in the colonial university, And that is the first source of fear, right? So a fear that spans through the entire history of the 19th century, since, of course, the imagining of the university and then its final institution in the model, following the model of the London University. Then, in the early 20th century, through a survey of student movements, right, in India, against the backdrop of the anti-colonial struggle, I try and show how, secondly, by seeing in the suturing of the student subject to a communistic imagination of the mass, to a communistic imagination of the public, a threat is perceived to what I call the ascetic demeanor of the knowing subject, right? So there is a certain kind of a presumed asceticism that is almost prescribed as the ideal gesture of the student subject, the ideal gesture of the student's being. And it is in the threat of a communistic imagination of the mass, right, or a communistic imagination of publicness, right, so that there is the positing of asceticism. There is the positing of what I call a seva ethic, right, so which is what the RSS then only starts minting and mobilizing much later, right, so, and that is again a history that is important for us to know, right, so that the seva ethic was not the invention of the RSS, right, so it goes back far before into the Anushilan Samiti, right, so, and of course around the moment of the Swadeshi movement, right, so, and I try and show how in this there is a threat to what I call the ascetic demeanor of Swadeshi intellectuality. In other words, a seva ethic is created or manufactured as the only legitimate ground for dedicating knowledge to the service of a national people, right? So almost miming a Nazi operation, which was called Wissensdienst in German, meaning knowledge service, knowledge as service to the state. And this is something that is happening through the anti-colonial movement in the early 20th century, and something that we see in the history that I chart in the book, from the Anushilan Samiti to, let's say, the Surit Samiti, right, so the Swadesh Bandhav Samiti, right, so, and of course the Dawn Society, Anti-Circular Society, all the way to the Hindustan Socialist Republican Association or the Naujawan Bharat Sarkar, right, so, and the threat of that kind of a communistic student subject is what gets then kind of internalized, right, so is what is then kind of neutralized through the positing and the postulating of a seva ethic as the only proper being of the student subject. Now, that is what I try and show, right, so through the story that I tell, right, so around what one can call the colonial history of Indian universities. And I show that if one looks at the post-colonial history coming from there, coming from this history of fear, or the or let's say the history of the twin fears of caste and religion, if one then comes to the post-colonial history, one will see that these fears still go out and haunt the very fact and imagination of the Indian university, whether through what I call the ideology of national welfare or through what is called the rule of the market, right? So it is these same fears of caste and religion, right, so that we see being either forced into the repressed unconscious of the Indian university, as it were, right, so through the ideology of national welfare, or it is these fears that are then taken up by capital, right, so as a direct source of its own entry, right, so as a direct source of the entry of the market, as a leveler of the discrimination perpetrated by the state, as a leveler of the kind of injustices perpetrated by the state. So how is it that the market enters, again, precisely to redress and correct the fears, as it were, right? And only to then compound these same fears of caste and religion. And then what I end with, right, by turning this entire history almost towards the NEP 2020, right, coming from what I have just said, right, through this entire history, what we see is that the fear of publicness, first in caste and then in religion, comes to, as I just articulated, comes to postulate the university, comes to project the university as the refuge of the private life of the mind. But what we see now in the Hindutva takeover, what we see right now in the age of what one can call a neoliberal Hindutva fascism, is a returning of that same fear, but a fear no longer of publicness, but a fear even of the private life of the mind. Right? What we saw through the entire history of the Indian university was a fear of publicness that had to be negotiated. That had to be negotiated through the enshrining of the private individual, right? Through the enshrining of the private virtues of intellectuality, as it were. What we see now is a fear even of the private force of intellectuality, right? And that is what I end with in the NEP 2020, where we see that the fear now is no longer in publicness. The fear now is in the disinterested, private pursuit of intellectuality. Even that has become a cause of danger. The only way in which the imminent risk within or the fear of the university could be neutralized now in the times of a neoliberal authoritarianism is by making intellectuality itself irrelevant to the university. Knowledge itself has to be hedged against the risks of. And this is what I call in the book, in the last chapter of the book, right, the derivatives trading model of the NEP-inspired platform university, right, where all you are being told to do is through this kind of a purchase and sale of multidisciplinary offerings, right, where you are taught a little bit of art of being happy or a little bit of science of happiness alongside the art of rangoli making in a mathematics course. As you would probably all know that the LOCF curriculum has just been brought out by the UGC, right, so which says that mathematics teachers must not only deal with Vedic mathematics but also the art of rangoli making. Right, so chemistry has to be all about the making of Indian beverages. So through all of this kind of derivatives trading, which is what I use the entire kind of analogy of the platform ecosystem to try and bust what I call the secret of multidisciplinarity, right, so where I say that finally, right, so through this kind of number one, multidisciplinary education, and number two, what is called a graded autonomy model, right, so where again there will be different tiers of institutions, what becomes apparent that it is that it is only non-knowledge that is the best bet against the risks of a radically uncertain future, right? Against the risks of a future which holds no jobs. And that is something that the NEP 2020 declares in as many terms, right? Where the Kasturi Rangan Committee report from again, most of you would be aware, right, so from it was submitted in 2018, published in 2019, the Kasturi Rangan Committee report, based on which the NEP 2020 is apparently sculpted, goes out and says it in as many words that the purpose of higher education is not to train students into a life of employment. It is to train students into the competencies of their first jobs, their second jobs, their third jobs, and their infinite jobs. Which basically means that education is now a preparation for the gig economy. Education is now formally about informalizing labor. Education must not come with any kind of misgivings anymore. And given that the future is so radically uncertain that one will only have to prepare oneself for indefinite number of jobs, right? The only thing that you can hedge against this radical uncertainty of the future with is non-knowledge. Because no knowledge works when it comes to a radically uncertain future. The only thing that you could probably then hedge against the risks of this world with is a course on Swachh Bharat, a course on Fit India, and a course on Rangoli making and the science of happiness. So that is where the fear finally has come, where the fear of publicness has been turned inward, and the fear that the university represents and embodies today is the fear even of disinterested private intellectuality. So that is the story that I try and chart in this book. I want to, I can take 1 more minute? Yeah. So I want to kind of end with a point that I made in the middle of my talk, where I said that Indian universities historically, right, so in terms of the entire policy archive of the thinking of an Indian university, right, so one finally comes to confront the fact that Indian universities have never had any encounter with something called academic freedom. We've never had, let alone a code on academic freedom, we've never even had, in policy terms, a debate on academic freedom. Neither in, let's say, the great Kothari Commission report, which is often cited in these times as the hope of a return to the liberal welfarist university, right, so nor in the successive reports and policies that came afterwards, right? But it is in the Kothari Commission report, right, that there is one particular reference that is made, and it's just a standalone reference. It's a work of art, right? And I think one has to really encounter that document to understand that it's a work of art, right? So it's a work of art where there's this one reference which is to a meeting held in February 1966 by what was called the Inter-University Board, the IUB, right, which debated on the question of academic autonomy. And from the minutes of that meeting, the Kothari Commission basically used a reference and kept it just as a supplementary note, without going out and commenting on it, without trying to incorporate it into the document, without allowing the philosophy behind the Kothari Commission's policy vision being impacted or influenced in any way by that reference. It just leaves it as an artifact, just there for you to read it. And I will just read what this supplementary note on university autonomy, right, from the IUB's February 1966 meeting, right, so actually says. It says, the board is of the opinion that a statutorily established university is practically in the same position as a statutorily established political government. And the mere fact that the legislatures of such governments have certain powers of legislation should not be utilized to lower the reputation of Indian universities and to make their efficient working impossible. Right? So it leaves the dream as an independent artifact, and a dream that has never been touched and never been achieved. Now, even the dream, as we know, right, so I started with the case of Palestine for us to know that even rights too can become dreams. And that is what has happened to the Indian university, right? So things that were imagined as rights, right? So that the right to the university is the right to a statutory independence, right? Where the university, as the Inter-University Board believes in 1966, is as good as a political government, right? So is as good as a statutorily established government, a government voted by popular mandate, right? So what was imagined as the right to the university can itself, or the right of the university, can itself turn into not just a dream, but as Langston Hughes calls, a soured dream, right? So a dream which is waiting to explode, and that's what we see right now. So I'll stop here, right? And probably I'll comment again on what others have to say. Thank you so much.
I audible? Thank you so much, JMI Academic, for having this very timely discussion on a book which is being written on a very critical theme. One thing about this book is that it is very difficult to critique it, not because I work on universities and not because we are living in a time where universities are very much under assault from the government, but also because the way this book is written. It would interest historians, people from literature, people from political science, and people from economics all together. So this is probably the beauty of this book, that it is a very well-researched book and also very timely. So I don't know if I have anything to critique the book, but I do have points which I think could have been added in the book and could have enriched the book more. But before talking about what I have to add, I'll just briefly take you all through a certain kind of journey that the book takes us through, and there might be a certain kind of repetition of arguments which Sir has already outlined for us, but please do bear with me. So the book talks about, I think the book talks about a lot of things, but it is primarily trying to tell us about a certain kind of political and economic context in which the history of university was situated pre and post-colonial India. So in what ways the universities are related to society, polity and economics is something that the book is trying to convey to us. So the book begins by asking a very important question. It begins by asking the question whether the idea of an Indian university exists or not. And the book is asking this question in a context where we see every now and then that there is a reference by the government and by the policy documents to a golden age where we had world-class universities, and that's what we must go back to. We need to go back to those ancient universities which had a glorious past and which were certain centers of Vedic learning, and that's what will make us the Vishnu Guru. So this is the first question that the book is asking, whether we really have something that we can fall back upon. And the author argues that no, we really don't. And as an example, there are certain points about the centers of learning like Takshila and Nalanda. They can at best be called centers of learning and cannot be called a university, because let's say for instance Takshila was there, but Takshila can be called a loose hub of scholars, let's say, that or can be equated with medieval guilds in certain manner that existed in Europe, that you can go get some money to a guru or a teacher and can ask them to give you or provide you a certain kind of learning, a certain kind of skill set. So that's what something you could do in Takshila. So there were teachers you could find for grammar, Vedic learnings, there were teachers you could find for medicine. All of that was there. There was a certain kind of system, but a loose system of scholarship where you can go to individual teachers and they can have students pay a certain kind of money, get a certain kind of education for a certain discipline. So there was no institutional space, there was no physical infrastructure as well that a university really requires. Also, in centers of learning like Takshila, you are not being given a certain kind of universal education, which is something necessary for an institution to be called a university. You are being trained to go back to your community, you are being trained to go back to your caste and perform and undertake the tasks and duties that you are required to perform to sustain in the society. So that's one reason why the reference to Takshila as an ancient university would be problematic. Now let's take the example of Nalanda. Nalanda can at best be called a center of monastic learning because it had a certain kind of patronage from the Buddhist monasteries. But then of course it cannot be called a university because you are only supposed to get teachings of a certain religion. You are only supposed to get some teachings of astronomy and grammar, but again you are not being acquainted with what the universal knowledge is all about. So you only have knowledge that can help you to live a certain kind of life of asceticism, a certain kind of life of spirituality. So that is not something that's going to help you in getting a certain kind of sense of what universal knowledge could be. So that is something very peculiar about monastic knowledge. Across medieval Europe also, before the existence of university, there were existence of a lot of kind of monasteries. But in monasteries, you could never ask questions. You will only be given a certain kind of religious teaching. For instance, in Christian monasteries, you will be given a certain kind of religious teachings, and you have to believe in that religious truth. You did not have the power to question that truth. So that's why any kind of monastery cannot be looked as a university. So that's one limitation that Nalanda would also have. Also, after a certain period of time, institutions or centers of learning like Nalanda and Takshila, they faded away. So they cannot sustain themselves with the evolution of society and state. That also says a lot about why they cannot be called as universities. So the whole fast that is being promoted by the establishment today, it looks like a symbolic mythical construction that the government or the establishment is trying to convey to us. So there were really no universities, there was no world-class civilization that were being taught in the university, and that's why we have to take this narrative with a pinch of salt. That's where the first argument of the book probably comes to an end, that there is no idea of Indian universities because not a lot of people had access to whatever center of learning were also existed at that point of time. Moving on, the book talks about how the British education system was established after the Macaulay Minutes came into being. But there's one point of departure which the author takes. So whenever we're talking about British education system, we often refer to the debate which happened between the Anglicists and the Orientalists, that which kind of education would be nice, whether vernacular traditional education or whether an English-speaking education, what kind of education we really need to give to the Indians in order to civilize them, in order to make them rational citizens. Now, the author is saying that the British were, this debate was not very much important to anyone. The British were more interested in giving a kind of education that can help them in moving on with the kind of establishment and government that they were running. And therefore, they decided to do away with all the vernacular native schools. Primarily because the vernacular native schools were actually more inclusive than the schools and the education system that the British promoted after a point of time. There's a very important reference in the book about the reports published by Sir William Adams, who were given the responsibility to go research and survey the condition of vernacular native schools. And in the three reports, he's consistently saying that these schools are actually much more inclusive in terms of who can teach and who can study in these schools. Whereas the English-speaking schools or the other schools which were later on established by the British were extremely exclusionary in nature. You will only see that people from certain castes are being able to teach and students from certain castes are only able to receive that education. There's also an important concept that the book talks about while talking about the British colonial education system, and that is the concept of how the British was serving, or the British higher education system was serving a secular complex of interest. Now what I understood from the book is that the introduction of the university space was supposed to be secular, in the sense that there will be no religious connotations attached to a university, there will be no caste connotations attached to a university, and it will primarily be an egalitarian space, everybody should have access to it. However, when you practically try to go and see, you will realize that the idea of this university which was established by the British as well, they also had a certain kind of saturation in terms of caste and religion. Just for an example, the Hindu college established in Calcutta, initially the students and the families of the students were not very receptive of admitting Muslim students. So that's something that tells us that religious anxieties was constantly there, and the British were not able to deal with it or delete them altogether. Also, when it comes to caste, between 1823 to let's say 1828, the fee of the Hindu college was raised 8 folds. So therefore we know that just like it is very difficult for students from marginalized backgrounds to take admission in these private universities, if we go back and see that if the fees within 5 years it is raised 8-fold, it would only be accessible to people coming from certain class. So therefore, even the British higher education system, which claimed that we are serving a secular interest, or the gates of the university is open to all, was actually serving a secular complex interest. Moving on, the book also talks about how the youth movements from 1904 to 1947, how the youth movements inside the universities and outside the universities as well were driven by a certain kind of religious and caste element. For instance, the logic of religious symbols and the logic of caste symbols were every now and then invoked in order to motivate students and motivate youth to come and join anti-colonial struggle. It's not something which is coincidental that the Gandhian ideals of spirituality and asceticism would often be used to motivate students to come and join the youth movement. It's also not something which is by coincidence that the Swadeshi movement would keep referring back to Mahabharata, keep referring back to symbols like Shakti, keep referring back to Shivaji, or keep critiquing the Mughal era and keep saying that we have to go back to a certain kind of ancient civilization and we have to come out of this economic exploitation. So if you're referring again and again to certain kind of religious symbols, that means that you believe that these religious symbols can motivate the youth to come and join you and give them a sense of collective. So that's something that Swadeshi movement did at a very larger level. So when these students who were part of the Swadeshi movement, when they will go to different communities and local villages, they would keep using these symbols in order to make sure that the people are, the young people as well as the old people are able to connect with them. Also, the magazines and the print network, which was very much in use by the youth who was trying to promote Swadeshi movement. For instance, the magazines like Vande Mataram, for instance, journals like Sandhya. There is only a certain kind of people with a certain kind of intellectual rigor or access to higher education who are able to read these magazines, who are able to relate with them, and then who are able to form a certain kind of perception in terms of why they want to join the anti-colonial movement. But there is still a whole group of the marginalized section who is not able to access education and therefore was not able to relate with these kind of print mediums which is being used to proliferate the idea of anti-colonial struggle. Similarly, in many of the anti-colonial movements, the use of theatre and play and many other kind of arts also started being used and became popular. But the book gives us examples that even in those plays, who is playing the character of whom would also portray a certain kind of caste and religious connotation. That the working class would always be portrayed as someone who does not have the agency and is being a follower of a leader who is, let's say, coming from a Bengali party group. So that's something where you can directly see that the use of caste and religious symbols was very prominent. It was only probably the Gadar party which in some ways was able to break away from the use of these religious symbols. But initially the Gadar party also used some of the Sikh principles related to egalitarianism to give a call for people to come and join their struggle. And over a period of time, an artist like Emma Goldman were able to influence a lot of people from Gadar party, influence Bhagat Singh, influence many other comrades from HSRA. However, now that's the difference. As far as you are being part, as a student or as a youth, you are being part of movements like the Swadeshi movement, which are telling you to perform a certain kind of religious duty to free your nation, you are accepted. But as soon as you become a part of parties like the Gadar party, which eventually, or HSRA, which eventually starts questioning the structural injustice which the colonial government is unleashing, or the structural injustice that are pertaining in the society, you are branded as an anti-national. So there's a reference in the book about the Meerut conspiracy case, and I think everyone of us should go back and read the case again because there were some excerpts in the book related to the case, and you'll be very surprised by the narrative that is being promoted by the government right now and the narrative that was promoted by the colonial government back then. So this whole binary of a nationalist, student, leader or movement or activist and someone who is questioning the structure who is part of the revolutionary movement has to be labeled as anti-national. This binary it goes back to basically the Meerut conspiracy case. So there was a certain kind of religious idiom attached for a long period of time to movements related to anti-colonial struggle, and as soon as any movement would try to break away from those religious symbols, they will eventually be called anti-national, communist, only working on the behest of a party and are irreligious and is trying to break the nation or society, etc., etc. I'm sure all of you can relate to it since we see it coming from the establishment very often. Moving on, in the second part of the book, chapter 4, 5 and 6 mostly talks about what happened in the post-independent India. It begins by arguing that the book is trying to map the shift. So it starts from the fact that in the post-independent India, government will try to tell you that we are moving on with certain kind of welfare policies which are important for achieving the nationalistic development goals. And then the book moves on towards explaining that for some reason, now the government cannot undertake the welfare development goals, so the market has to intervene. So how the state then starts giving market some more space in order to achieve those goals. And then moving on, the last chapter of the book tells us that how the state then, in the end, with the coming of Amity 2020, it paves the way towards a platform university and links it to the platform economy. So as soon as the first commission comes on national education policy, it talks about the fact that caste and religion should not be having much of a space while we draw a framework of national education. So they delete it altogether without acknowledging the fact that much of the higher education discourse in terms of who gets an access is related to what happened in the pre-colonial India. It's very much related to in what ways caste and religion was looked at. So that part, that caste and religion does have a bearing on higher education, that part was absolutely deleted, neglected in the first policy itself. The idea was that the Aditya Commission argued that we have to move towards modernizing goals, we have to move towards development goals, move towards nation building. And in order to achieve all of this, we have to have rational democratic citizens. We have to make these students into national democratic, very disciplined citizens in order to undertake the goal of national development. However, and a certain kind of student activism is also fine. So far, that this activism and the student movements are related to the idea of seva and nation building. As soon as the revolutionary ideas are taken or become central to any student movement, then there is a problem because you are disrupting the whole idea and the whole movement of nation building. So eventually, because you need a rational citizen, a disciplined student, the idea of scientific temper was invoked again and again. And it was also said that scientific temper is something that is going to get you employment, and social justice is also something which can be fixed by giving employment. So both of these things, scientific temper and social justice, can be fixed by raising national productivity. So social justice is not related to the historical structural marginalization that the communities have been facing. It is something related to people not getting employment. So let's get people employment, everything would be fixed. And therefore, the author says that there was a call to give workerly education, provide work, and all the ailments of the nation can then be resolved. Now, in order to increase employability or in order to create more professionals, there was a call to establish more and more IITs. But then comes the question, who are the people who actually have the social, economic and educational capital to be the first generation entrants inside the IITs? So despite the fact that more professional institutions were open, despite the fact that there is some reference to social justice in the NEP, we do see that the whole domain of higher education in certain ways limited the idea of access, limited the access to marginalized castes also and to religious minorities also. And this is what the author says, that this is a certain kind of myopia of caste which the Indian state has. It doesn't want to look at it altogether. It's saying that once the idea of welfare is established, once they have achieved the idea of modernization through welfare, everything else can be very easily resolved. Moving on, the fifth chapter of the book mostly talks about the 1986 Kothari Commission report. And the author says that Kothari Commission presents initially a very convincing case in terms of resolving everything that is wrong in higher education and also in the country. And it argues that we really need to open the gates of the university for women. We really need to open the gates of the university for people coming from socially and educationally backward communities, and that we have to make sure that they get a certain kind of social, economic as well as educational mobility. So these are the ideas that are being promoted in the report initially. But a deeper analysis of the report will tell you that the state wants to do all of this but does not want to take the responsibility of doing all of this. So deeper analysis will tell you that the state, in a very subtle manner, giving the responsibility of providing social justice or providing access of education to everyone, the responsibility is being given to community efforts and to market, private philanthropic efforts and community efforts. So basically market. So the 1986 report is like a neoliberal term when we are talking about higher education, and also that I'm sure all of us are aware that how neoliberalism came to India post 1990s, there were structural changes, etc. So that is something that is also reflected in the 1986 report. So everything about social justice then merely remains an idea, all mouth talk, and nothing is being really implemented because private philanthropy and community efforts did not have that kind of authority, did not have that kind of power to really provide certain kind of social mobility. And therefore, the exclusion on the basis of religion and caste continued, but no report tried to acknowledge it, only provided lip service. However, it was only after 1980s or 1990s that certain movements which were related to caste assertion post the Monty Commission report began to happen, and it was not the will of the state, it was the movements led by the students, movements led by certain political parties that in some ways tried making efforts to open the gates for the university. The chapter also argues that these two things are happening at the same time. So the one strand is that we are, even after 1986 policy, we can say that there is no talk about social mobility, but we are giving space to market to fix those ailments. But at the same time, market is also promoting certain kind of injustices by emphasizing too much on the idea of merit, and by emphasizing that this idea of merit is casteless, it is caste neutral. So you gain as much merit as you can, and then you will be given employment, and then you will eventually have social mobility. So this is what 1986 report has for all of us. Some movements were there. Since 1967 itself, we saw the emergence of Naxalbari movement, and that did try to challenge what was happening in institutions of higher education and also what was happening with the peasants and labor in various parts of the world. But the impact of that movement I believe, was limited to certain regions. The impact of that movement could not really go to other regions. However, some traces of the movement and some traces of the method in which the movement was carried out can still be seen inside universities and the left organizations that we have in universities today. The last chapter of the book is pretty interesting because everywhere else you will see a critique of NEP in terms of how it is pitching the narrative of Hindutva, trying to create all of us in they are trying to create a certain kind of ideological narrative inside the university which relates to Hindutva, and the other critiques will say that there is a certain kind of push to commercialization. So, and both of these critiques are right, but what Professor Bhattacharya would add is that this is what you see at the surface. You see that the whole public discourse is surrounded by how LEP 2020 or how the establishment is trying to push a certain kind of ideological narrative, national, anti-national narrative, ideological narrative that a certain kind of national and cultural unity is required, but beneath that a lot of other undercurrents are taking place in terms of what's happening in the economy. So we call it anxious, there are certain scenes of anxious clutter behind. So there are economic anxieties, there is a funding crisis, there is global competition, and the state does not know how to deal with that. So all of this is sidelined. And we are only talking about the narratives which are related to cultural and national unity. Now what this NEP tries to does is, it tries to make us a part of an asset economy. So there are 2-3 things, I mean there are a lot of things that the NEP is trying to do, but let's say that it's trying to push the idea that we should have an academic bank credit system, which is trying to push an idea that we should prepare ourselves for the future risks. Nobody knows what the future risks are. So that's one thing about neoliberal economy. You don't really know what is going to happen. So there is a displacement of an education system that can give you holistic knowledge, that can give you research, there is a unity of teaching and learning, and this kind of idea of education is being replaced by individuals bearing certain kind of credits, and those credits will decide what their value in the market is. And there is no, you really don't know whether there is certain kind of stability in terms of how much value you will have of those credits in the market in future. So the risk is always there. So the NEP 2020 is trying to prepare you for the risk that they don't even know exist. And also, they are not trying to prepare you of the risk that the economy is bringing by giving you the best kind of education. They are trying to provide, they are trying to fix it, they are trying to prepare you by only giving you knowledge, some knowledge about everything. So I don't know how that is going to prepare people for full-fledged job. That is only going to prepare people for certain kind of informal labor, or as rightly said, gig economy. The best part of the end of the book is how the idea of platform economy, platform university, and totalitarianism is linked. So the author at the end invokes the idea of Hannah Arendt. And he says that totalitarianism is something which is different from the other kind of dictatorships and tyranny. Why? Because totalitarianism makes the idea of law and legality redundant. And it says that the establishment and the authority itself is the embodiment of law, or the embodiment, or has been the embodiment of law historically. So that's why this is difficult. Totalitarianism is much difficult than authoritarianism or tyranny or dictatorship. And in order to make people believe that establishment is the embodiment of law or nature, you need certain kind of subjects. Now, how are you going to create those subjects? Education institutions are very much the spaces where certain kind of narratives can be indoctrinated in the minds of young students. So therefore, in order to undertake that ideological narrative, a certain kind of education system is pitched. And also, totalitarianism can only sustain when people are distant from each other and also distant from the objective conditions that are around them. So you are distant from the world that you have around, the material world, and you are also distant from each other. So totalitarianism believes that there has to be a break in the sense of collectiveness. There has to be a break in the way you assume that you are a public. So loneliness is something that totalitarianism would try to promote every now and then. Now a lot of people would say that loneliness is fine because in universities, you have to research, you need a certain kind of solitude. There's a difference. Solitude is required, of course, because especially for doing philosophy, but loneliness is something which is like pushing you in a shell, and it restricts your movement, it restricts you from identifying with what is happening around you in the world, and it restricts you in raising your concern about what is happening around you. So therefore you are made to believe that everything which is being pushed by the government is right. So that the link between totalitarianism and education is something which is very intriguing, and Platform University does it very well. Platform University is like a digital network that you have. Platform University will tell you that credit system is very nice. Platform University will multiple entry-exit options. So all of this fuels into a certain kind of platform economy, making you into a fit for a certain kind of informal labor or certain kind of gig economy, and also it pushes a certain sense of loneliness and takes you away from that sense of public and sense of collective. I think that the end part is something that many of you will relate to and would enjoy reading. Now this is about the book. There are only certain things that can be added. And as I said in the beginning, it's very difficult to critique the book. All of you are going to relate to the book in so many ways. So just to probably add certain points, I think a discussion about how the idea of university evolved in the medieval and modern Europe could have made the book more holistic in nature and could have given a sense that why there is no Indian idea of university, why this is all very problematic. The idea of university in some ways emerged in the West. So how did it really emerge from medieval to modern university, how the transformation happened? That's something that could have been added. The second thing which could have been added is related to, I think, the discussion of the making of AMU and BHU. That's an interesting discussion, and it has a certain kind of bearing in terms of how the religious exclusion happened, and how certain kind of religious stigma is also attached to universities like Jamia and AMU. There's reference of Jamia and AMU in the book, but I think the history of how AMU and BHU were made, how the making of these two universities was very much rooted in the language debate of Urdu and Hindi. And then also the idea was rooted in who is going to get access, which community is going to get access to public offices in colonial administration. That discussion might have been useful. I also believe that some more discussion about the political context in universities like Allahabad could have been helpful, because there's a lot of reference to Bengal in the book. Writing a little bit reference to other regions could have helped, because Allahabad was very much a university from above. So it had a lot of British patronage. And for the longest period of time, it did not actively participate in the anti-colonial struggle. Only after a student was shot during a flag hoisting ceremony that Allahabad University students really actively started taking part in the movements. So a bit of reference to that might have helped. I also think that in the Indian context, what qualified the logic of neoliberalism is something that we can look at. Why the Indian society was okay with the Indian state implementing the neoliberal logic on higher education. Some of the authors have argued that it was the middle class who kicked the ladder away for the marginalized section. So the middle class who took the benefit of the welfare state and was able to gain certain public offices became affluent over a period of time and had the capacity to send their children in private universities or even in expensive public universities. And they thought that it is okay to kick that ladder away which they use. They thought it is okay to kick it away for the marginalized section. So I think that is something which could have been added, that why neoliberal logic was accepted in the Indian state. The other thing is a bit about the history of neoliberalism. I think Philip Mirovsky is someone who has talked a lot about the history of neoliberalism and how neoliberalism seeped inside first the discipline of medicine and then later the discipline of economics and then social sciences as a whole, neglecting the domain of humanities. That's also something that we could have talked about. The idea that, you would often hear it, that why social justice should not be implemented in private domain is because the idea of quality is very important. Bill Dietings talk about it in such an apt manner. He says that nobody really knows what the idea of quality is. What is this idea of quality and excellence? So if you look at some of the NAC indicators also, you will know that our idea of figuring out what quality is also very problematic. So we keep going back to the buzzword of quality and excellence, but nobody really defines it. There is no standardized definition of it. Every university, every education institution interprets it in some other way. Even the state does not know what the quality is. So there's a shift from University of Culture to University of Quality or University of Excellence without really determining what excellence really means. My last point would be that I believe that there has to be a discussion about the politicization of the seat of Vice Chancellor in universities. Because we all know, late theorist Amrit Singh has talked a lot about it. In the recent times, Professor Amity has talked about it, that the seat of Vice Chancellor has always been political. There was always a certain kind of political vulnerability attached to it, but that vulnerability was mitigated in some ways by the kind of academic credentials the people had and by the kind of respect the politicians and parties would have for them because they were academically nice. That is something that we do not see now. The only eligibility to become a Vice Chancellor, we all know, is that you need to have certain kind of ideological inclinations. And that is something which is becoming extremely dangerous for the university. So, and what does it really do? It makes sure that the diktats of the government, the orders, the policies are implemented without questioning it. So during my fieldwork, this is something that the previous generation teachers and administration would again and again say that earlier we had some space to adjust the policies according to us or sometimes question them, but that is something that we do not have the power to do today. So Professor Amity would say that there is a certain kind of fundamentalism of letter, that you have to implement every policy in not in its spirit but by letter. So I believe that the book could have had no discussion about the politicization of governing bodies or the politicization of the seat of Vice Chancellor. Thank you.
And many congratulations, Debaditya, for this book, and of course, accomplishment. So, I don't know how to start, but I felt like while reading, I felt that perhaps I'm not competent enough to make some kinds of judgment of this book, because it has to do with a lot of intricate histories and also some of the movements that you're trying to capture that, like, often goes into different kinds of layers and perhaps not my domain, so that I would accept. But I have some kinds of remark and some kinds of discussion, and I think Chetna has already covered the longer kinds of, and you have already deliberated upon that whole aim of writing this book and what is happening with the university that we all are very much familiar with. I usually avoid this discussion around university. I write about many other things, but not on the university. Because I have full conscience, coming the first generation of the scholar who is entering the university with lot of utopia, lot of hope. And I will say to an extent university provides you that. At least for 6 months, at least for a year, at least for some time. I think whoever has come from the first generation and have seen the life of the university, I think that is quite revealing for anybody. And therefore, how to see and how to read this university as space, I think it also needs to be contextualized from which vantage point you are looking at. Is it first generation? This is your third generation, fourth generation, and I think that needs to be contextualized somewhere. And that is what I felt about this life of the university, idea of the university, and because it cannot have a general history. University is a site where people are coming from different walk of life, and they are having a very different kinds of engagement. So one that you come with a lot of utopia and coming from the kinds of Indian social or Indian public, and that is what I feel that, because I'm going not into the details, but I'm going to more critical points that I'm interested in. I would like to avoid the public itself. I'm not interested in public. I would like to see the university that does not have any connection with the public. So some kinds of a space, because if you are considering the nature of Indian public, if you are considering the nature of Indian social, then most of the time, and I will say maximum time, that we know that what kinds of value they produce. And therefore mapping the whole discourse of university through some kinds of notion of publicness becomes a kinds of first goal. And I also think about some kinds of possibility. Of course, we can do that kinds of engagement where you have perhaps very different kinds of public. So I'm not undermining or a public who is coming with some kinds of
movement and emancipatory goals, then that creates a very interesting kinds of debate, because even in India you have this whole debate that, okay, like Indian universities are islands, they are not in connect with the public, and that criticism is made from inside and outside both. That you are very much here in JMU, but you are not having any connection with Murita, that we usually get this kinds of criticism. But if you know the history of Indian university, and you give like a whole elaborate examples where Indian university is playing a lot of interesting roles, like a pivotal role in nationalist movement, religious movement, different other kinds of movement, so that becomes one kind of interface. And second, even for thinking about more like a sites we consider as underground, and some of the sites which we consider that perhaps university does not play a role, like basic issues of like affirmative action, reservation, coming of some kinds of policies, and I think necessarily universities have that kinds of interface, where like publicness becomes a very interesting kind of discourse. But when while reading your book, I don't get the sense of publicness, which publicness we should hand over to this university, and then what is going to be this idea of the university. So many times for me, university comes as a kind of forced discussion that I don't want to participate, but because you are in that space, so necessarily you have to talk about that, and we many times also end up talking about that. So first of all, it captures a wide range of the book. I'm talking about very general idea. So it captures a wide range of topics from the great ancient Indian universities to the present crisis, including NEP, and some thoughts on the university futures. I come from Nalanda, very much near Nalanda. And it was eye-opening for me, because I also had the same talking about Nalanda University at least, that oh, this is a great, used to be a great site of learning. They used to have some kinds of observatory and all kinds of things. But while reading your book, that was like staggering kinds of like things that happened to me. That oh my God, okay, so this was the nature of the university. And you're quite right, like you quite elaboratively discussed about Takshila, you discussed about like Nalanda, and then you think about the idea of the university itself. And therefore, when you say that in the second page, very second page, when you say that it is not that idea of the university at a stake, I think I would say that I would like to reiterate that it is very much the idea of the university at a stake that comes across your chapters. Necessarily we are going back to constantly when you are critiquing this idea of the Indian or some notion of the Indianness that is getting imposed on us. Then we want to also look for some kinds of ideals of the university. And the example that you are given from Gaza, you are given from other parts of the world, I think what is at the stake is the idea of the university. And then when you are coming to this idea of the university, then the question comes to very, very fundamental level. Do we have university itself in India? Very fundamental, first of all, going through your critique, we can ask this very fundamental question, whether we ever had the idea of the university in a more sense of some kinds of resonating with the universal ideals that one can talk about, freedom, liberation, different other kinds of goals that universities are supposed to provide, or universities are supposed to be kinds of utopia where one can think about those questions. So, and then you have wonderful discussion taking from Tagore also, that I think and that also looking for some kinds of idea of the national university, and Tagore himself had a lot of critique about this idea of the nationalism and also idea of the national university. But again, that becomes very interesting kinds of paradox, that one side you are talking about materiality of the university, some kinds of life, real life of the university, or one can say that some kinds of infrastructure of the university, very infrastructure of the university. So when one is saying that very infrastructure is coming under crisis, what exactly we are talking about? Are we just talking about building? Are we talking about things? Because you have the privatization, corporatization, you have many universities which have lot of new buildings and things like that. But again, the crisis still remains there. So how we are going to theorize the very idea of the materiality that constitutes the life of the university in some kinds of dissociation of the idea of university. So that would be my first question, because you put it quite prominently that you are not interested perhaps in this idea of the university, but more in its interface with the publicness, more its interface with some kinds of other things. Coming back to the question of is there a Indian university that taking your vantage point I'm asking, and same questions was raised by A.K. Ramanujan in Indian writing about that is there an Indian way of thinking, and then he gives a very very I will say, paradoxical kinds of like situation where like he's saying that yes, but again in a different way. And he gives example of his own father, who's like in morning he is doing astrology. So in morning he will do proper astrology where he's going to read palm of the people around, and by 9:30 he's in office becoming astronomer, proper scientist. So in morning you are reading astrology as a proper astrologer, and by 9:30, 10 you are really going to office becoming proper scientist. So this whole dichotomy that we are talking about, some kinds of paradox that we are talking about, I think necessarily inform each other. And therefore, like this like crisis that we are talking about. So one, we can talk about like more global crisis that is happening with the university in terms of ideas, and second that like some kinds of universities in India, whether we had that one, and that can become like again another way of thinking about utopia and things. So I also think some kinds of like a lot of, one can be very critical about this idea of the university, and but again like some kind of think in terms of opening. And I have some encounter with like not necessarily in JNU, going to teach in Wardha where we have like university first generation learners coming with like all the hope that they are going to see the university. That itself was some kinds of another kinds of benchmark. Liminal already happened. That like some transgression already happened, and that is becoming possible to the university or the size of university. So I think like those nuances, we can have a whole like kinds of critical discussion about university, but again, or whether like whether university is functioning like a university, whether university is able to have hold that ideas of the university, but very name of the university, very nomenclature of the university, very like the site of the university are able to do something. And I think perhaps I miss those like stories, those narratives, and because when you are reading through Bhadraloka and stuff like these narratives, then we definitely miss those narratives, and then it becomes some kind of site of, and we all are very much familiar with that, how university becomes a site of religious mobilization, feudal elements coming together, but also we necessarily need to talk about a lot of transformation within that section also. It may be very minimal, like one can accept that maybe like even 10%, I will accept 5%, but that has been a great transformation at the level of personality, at the level of thinking about ideology, at the level of different kinds of people we meet and become different. So is there a space in which we can think about this book, about the Indian university, in a more, I will say perhaps in a more, like perhaps in a different way than that, like So, and then you go into this whole idea about, just one second, yeah. So then we have like a collegiate system, and you quite rightly remarked about this whole like that how, if you are taking the example of Kolkata University or University in Bengal, then it was almost becoming collegiate kinds of system. And we can relate with collegiate system in judiciary, which like so that which family are going to come, how they are going to like carry their legacy in different ways. But we also had in the same period, I think we also had other universities that was coming out. So for example, what was happening in BHU, what was happening later on Aligarh Muslim University. So one can read through collegiate system, but there is also possibility that, so is there a possibility to read university with all crises, with all problems, with some other kinds of dissonance, with some kinds of rebellious attitude that that happened only because of the university, and that only happened in the university spaces. So yeah, that was like kind of my readings and things, but again, with your analysis of Amity, like I will say no education policy basically. So is that like many times I feel that is there a document to discuss that one. But again, you have done a whole thorough analysis that I really feel that they are not the person to make any kinds of like judgment or analysis in that way. So sorry for that part. But again, I had some of these questions in my mind while reading this book. But thank you so much, and congratulations again for writing this wonderful book.
तुम बैठ के बोलना चाहो?
अच्छा, आपने ये दिया, मैं तो पहले बोला था कोई वो था, ओके, आई एम द लास्ट वन.
शायद चलेगा. कोई नहीं चलता है.
इसको ले आओ. I think so. Aditya has an injury. So just to give people a background, so Aditya, who's our final discussant of the book, he's had an injury, he's had an accident. Even after that, he's here to discuss the book. So I have to eternally indebted to him.
First of all, thank you, JMI Academy, for inviting me for such a interesting and great discussion and sharing the panel with such esteemed personalities. So, also I would like to thank Professor Debaditya for writing the history of an institution which we all interact constantly, but this institution is also one of the least discussed when it comes to what does an university actually symbolizes. How policies around these educational institutes carry the weight of political and economic aspirations, especially the political and economic aspirations not of the people but of the state. Why sometimes universities like Allahabad University or Banaras Hindu University, BHU, are so deeply entrenched into the geography of that particular city that these universities actually share an integral part into the memory of its own, what we can say, student subject. So, for instance, if those people who belong to Banaras or nearby areas, they might know that the presidential debate at BHU used to be a very important cultural event all around the Banaras, and people came together to register their presence at that event. So I think this is what actually sometimes we miss about the university, that university is not about the people living or studying inside that campus, but it also sometimes integrates its infrastructure and the students and the debates and the whole lot of things that are going within the university with the people living outside the campus in the city and the whole speciality of that region. So this book, I think, shall be read with an approach similar to reading a gazetteer, as this book is not just about the history of Indian universities, rather it is actually about the history of ideas behind the making of Indian university throughout its 6 chapters. The partition which Professor Debaditya has also made, namely stories of a making, this is the first section, and histories of a re/unmaking, quite remarkably presents the early colonial as well as its anti, or we can say, nationalist challenges involved in structuring the functionalities of a university in India. The second part, however, locates the post-colonial Indian university, which is actually consistently carrying its post-coloniality within state planning, Nehruvian welfare ideology, neoliberal restructuring of our economy, and as well as digital capitalism. It also examines the transformation of functions of a university, how this institution actually shifted from a public institution of nation building to a site of market driven reforms and the managerial logics of the market under which it has to function. So I would rather say that this emphasis is actually more diagnostic, to show how policies, economic frameworks and global trends have progressively hollowed out the public ethos of the university. And also this whole drawing parallels between the global trends is not actually a new trend. I would like to quote Professor Debaditya into this from the book. So, Professor Debaditya says that, however, it is interesting that the Constitution's desire to live past the colonial legacy of industrial modernity while also insisting on a unique trajectory of nationalist welfare had to repeatedly rely on adulatory comparisons with the United States. In its discussion on every aspect of university reform, the American context became the most opportune reference as well as uncritical example for comparatively scaling the trajectories of national growth in India. The post-war geopolitical balance of power must of course have been running thread for policy thinking in contemporary India. So these are a whole lot of trajectories which are being drawn in this book. I would also like to start, the whole discussion which was going through about the student politics and the youth movements within the university. So, with its popular appeal successively dwindling among the youth of the cities, the AISF soon pressed its student squads into relief work during the deadly Bengal famine of 1943. The agrarian uprisings of 1946-47, namely the Tevaga and the Telangana, renewed a pledge for the communist student revolutionaries to stay away from the nationalist ceremony of political independence of 1947. However, this particular fact was next year challenged, not next year but in 1946, Nehru was in a student congress conference. Nehru said that to offer political leadership to the country is not the function of the student movement in India. They cannot recommend any action to the country. Of course, this does not apply to conditions that are created in a time of crisis. Students, instead of taking part in politics, should go to the villages when they find time, and there they should try to improve the conditions of our poor country. So, what I want to, the point which I want to make is that how university and the students are being consistently discussed as subject about what they are doing and what they should do, both in the time of crisis and in the period of post-independence. Now for the student community, the first concern that comes to us after getting into the university premises is how accessible our universities are or will be for the upcoming generations. This very act of concern in itself is a political act without even taking active participation into student or campus politics. The diligent discussion around, because Chetna has already given a very brief and thorough summary of the book, I would not like to go chapter by chapter, so I would like to focus on very few points. The diligent discussion around various educational committees also assumes critical importance at this point, as it quite clearly marks how universities as institutions were imagined and constantly reorganized by the Indian state. However, social justice finds some mention in the imaginative part of these educational committees, despite having deep flaws with its definitions and avenues. The Radhakrishnan report swiftly describes social justice as the freeing of the individual from poverty, unemployment, malnutrition and ignorance, and emphasizes that educational opportunity needs to be measured in vague terminologies of talent and ability, which we all know are used as precursor to protect the bastion of merit. There is also a quote which I would like to read from. So in the Radhakrishnan committee, I am quoting from the Radhakrishnan committee, that education according to the Indian tradition is not merely a means to earning a living, nor is it only a nursery of thought or a school for citizenship. It is initiation into the life of spirit, a training of human souls in the pursuit of truth and practice of virtue. It is a second birth, Dvitiya Janam. And Professor Debaditya has very well, what we can say, traces these whole within the line casteism, or what we can say, what he describes as communal feudal relations, in these committees, how these committees are still functioning between these relations, and how these committees actually suffer to come out of the rural feudal backdrop of India. So also that I use this precursor to protect the bastion of merit, and this whole narrative of talent and ability was then argued because of the dominant narrative of nation building, and it only became a subservient medium to meet these inwardly national but sometimes outwardly international narratives, which we also see in the emphasis of India being Vishwaguru in the National Education Policy 2020. A very important and thoughtful distinction which Professor Debaditya makes in the intent of education being delivered, namely citizenly education and the workerly education. Both of these educations neatly serve their intended purposes, as the former is rooted in the Nehruvian welfare imagination of an university and envisions the student as citizen in the making, responsible for participating in democracy, building the nation and cultivating critical, liberal and ethical capacities, while the later carries the responsibility of uplifting the socially backward individuals, where obviously the socially is defined only in clear economic terms in both the committees, in the Kothari, in both the commission, the Kothari Commission and in the Radhakrishnan Commission. It also resonates in this book that this citizenly education is somehow creates a citadel around it, and which is unable to penetrate by the recipients of the workerly education. The very first thing, or the very first example which came into my mind with the idea of citizenly education is the movie called Swadesh. The kind of education Shah Rukh Khan is getting in Swadesh, that going back to your villages, how to become a good citizen, is what he is getting in citizenly education. But the education in the what we can say till the secondary level, this secondary level education is the workerly education, which is bare minimum required to uplift your economic mobility. Uplift your economic mobility, to not mention your social backwardness. This is why this whole idea of citizenly education and workerly education is important. So to explain this, I would also like to quote an example from Professor Debaditya from the report named National and Educational Development, also the Kothari Commission's second name. First, sorry. So, the Commission insisted on an eventual abolition. This is the Kothari Commission. The Commission insisted on an eventual abolition of tuition fees at all levels of education, for the simple purpose of maximizing the benefits of public instruction for those who are historically disprivileged. But in the same case, in the same breath, it went on to cite the excuse of resource scarcity to privilege the universal provisioning of preschooling over the demand for free colleges. This is why the workerly education is being prioritized. This same insistence on workerly education can be traced back in later published report called Report on a Policy Framework for Reform in Education, popularly called as Ambani Birla Report, constituted in 2000, which suggested that the readjustment of national priorities in favor for a lower levels of schooling as opposed to college/tertiary education would, they argued, be a more practical means to Indian masses considering scarce resources. So, this book has been a very profound and very thoroughly researched document for all those people who are studying in a university, who aspire to be in a university, and for all those first generation learners who want to know how these universities, why these universities are as they see them. And at the last, I just wanted to add a point that whenever the whole idea of social justice was very much discussed in all the commissions which this book has actually has gone through, but still we have seen that why the question of caste arises only when a student describes his birth as a fatal accident, rather it being discussed and enacted through the realm of educational policy formations. Thank you.
So maybe Debaditya, you can just reply and
Yeah. Okay.
or shall we take some few questions?
Yeah, I think we can take a few
Yeah.
questions and then I can.
So it's already getting late, so we will take 4-5 questions. Yeah, please.
I hope
Yeah.
loud enough. So basically, you talked about the transition, basically from the vantage point of fear. So on the initial points you talked about, there was a fear of publicness, or then after the caste and religion. Then the last the phase you talked about the fear of private intellectual pursuit. So I wanted to know about the transition to the last fear. I'm not able to comprehend the last fear. Why is it fearing from that pursuit? Pursuit of the intellect at the in private space. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
May I have your name, please?
Yeah, I'm PhD scholar at CPS Chotelal. That's my name.
My question, am I audible?
Yeah.
My question is, when you are evaluating the distinction between university and center of knowledge, is in history, has there been any university for that matter? Or everything has been at the center of learning, knowledge or whatever? And in that evaluation, when we are evaluating Nalanda and Takshashila in particular, can we also evaluate the Western universities where the idea came from? Has they been the center of, again, the colonialism, expansion? The whole idea also came from industrial revolution, etc. So, has there been such an ideal and the space of university, and which do not work together? Or there are different ideas of university where we can also evaluate in similarly to Takshashila and Nalanda. And when I also think about Vincent's diary, there are evidences of heterodox schooling, not in Nalanda, but in Puspagiri, like the heterodox school, where Naya is also taught alongside Vedanta. In Arthashastra we get reference of Lokayata, Charava, right? How did Madhyamika came as a critic? How did Yogasara came as a critic? And how all these, when someone is talking about how all this came together in a debate between Theravada and Mahayana during Harshvardhan. So can you also see universal, the certain presence of universal access and universal education critique, etc. present there, and certain that we can also question of the time we are speaking about?
Thank you. Yeah, please.
Thank you, Debaditya. It was a very interesting presentation. The way in which you framed about the disappearance of university, I think it was good. I have not read the book, so I'll not speak around abstract kind of ideas. So I was thinking about something like the contemporary manifestation of something called faculty development program. So whenever we think about the critical history of university, we see that how faculty is imagined, how faculties are supposed to be developed. So can you, or have you gone through a genealogy of the ways in which, for example, how faculties have been thought about, or because it's these times faculty development programs are kind of simply a bureaucratic exercise or a kind of ideological indoctrination kind of exercise, nothing else. In that sense, can you speak something about it?
Yes, last one perhaps. Yeah, please.
So my question is, I think जो आइडियल यूनिवर्सिटी की बात आप कर रहे हैं वो एक इगैलिटेरियन यूनिवर्सिटी होना चाहिए, जो कि ना पहले था और अभी जो भी यूनिवर्सिटी के बारे में आप बात कर रहे हैं वहाँ पर भी अभी नहीं है एग्जैक्टली। तो ये एक आइडियल सिचुएशन की हम मांग कर रहे हैं, लेकिन साथ ही साथ जो राइज ऑफ प्राइवेट यूनिवर्सिटीज़ है या प्राइवेट यूनिवर्सिटी जो प्लेटफॉर्म यूनिवर्सिटी का जो एक कॉन्सेप्ट कह सकते हैं कि वो प्लेटफॉर्म यूनिवर्सिटी अलग सेंस में, लेकिन प्राइवेटाइजेशन जिस तरीके से बढ़ रहा है, बिरला अंबानी रिपोर्ट हो या फिर लगातार जो प्राइवेट यूनिवर्सिटी को लगातार फेम देने की कोशिश है और पब्लिक यूनिवर्सिटी की फंडिंग एंड ऑल हर चीज़ को कट की जा रही है, तो क्या एक प्राइवेट यूनिवर्सिटी इगैलिटेरियन यूनिवर्सिटी हो सकती है या फिर क्या एक प्राइवेट यूनिवर्सिटी वो आइडियल यूनिवर्सिटी हो सकती है जो हम जिसकी हम मतलब इमेजिनेशन कर रहे हैं, और अगर नहीं तो फिर पब्लिक को कैसे बचाया जाए?
Okay, is that it?
Yes.
Okay, so I'll just go up there and yeah. Okay, first of all, I think I should just thank everybody, right? So everybody who's been here, right, for all this while, but also all the people who've tried engaging with the work, right? So, of course, my fellow panelists, right? So my colleagues and my friends, right? So who have tried engaging with the book with such deep perceptiveness, right? So, and I think I'm absolutely incapable. So I should begin by acknowledging the fact that I'm absolutely incapable of addressing a lot of the questions that you have actually raised. I can only try and engage in conversation with you and try and see where this work can eventually lead in conversation with the apodias that you have pointed at. So that is what I have to begin by acknowledging. Also the people who've asked questions, thank you so much. Now I will just begin by taking some of the questions that I can probably deal with here, right? And so to begin with Chetna, I mean, I think Chetna, thank you so much. That was just the most accurate critical summary of the work that I could have ever hoped for, right? And it was not just a critical summary, but it also came with a deep set of reminders and I think intellectual corollaries which could have been taken into account, right? So, and which could have potentially enriched this book. So thank you so much. I think, I mean, some of the questions that you've raised, I'll try and address them very briefly, right? So you have basically flagged a few points that you thought could have been included in order to make the work a little more contextually grounded, but also a little more, let's say, globally framed, as it were, right? So framed in a larger kind of global context. So you said that a discussion about the university, about how the university evolved in medieval to modern Europe, might really benefit the discussion. And I do agree. It's just that I mean, this is work that already exists, and this is work that I, if I were to try and bring it into the purview of this book, would have probably just taken taken 2 volumes, if not more, right, for the book to have been written. But I do understand that that history and that context is very important for us to understand how the concept of the modern university enters India, right? And in a sense, and I think I'm taking off from Chetna's very deep comments, right? I do want to also register the point, which is an answer to some of the questions that have been raised otherwise as well, part of Brahm's pointers as well, which is that yes, I mean the university is regarded as a knowledge institution, and what is called therefore in the terms that have framed the discourse about the university as a corporative organization, right? So as an institution with not just a body of its own, but also a consciousness of its own body. That is the coming of the university in a sense, right? So where an institution is to be identified not just by the physicality of its infrastructure, but also by the consciousness of a community inhabiting that physical infrastructure. Now that consciousness of a corporative university, and a corporative university is very different from the corporate university, right? So the corporative university is the university in body, right? So the embodied university, and the embodied university then kind of being practiced in and through a consciousness of a community. Right, so that is the meaning of, let's say, the corporative university, as it were, which is what it has been argued across the scholarship on the university, right, which is what gives a sense of an institution to the university, right, so which it turns out, right, so if one looks at the entire discourse, the scholarly discourse on the history of the university, well, it turns out that this is something that was integrally the gift of modernity, right, so the gift of, as it were, European modernity, colonial modernity, right? So, and even in the colonial context, even in medieval Europe, right? So the kind of universities that we had, which was called the medieval universitas, right? So they were primarily guilds. They were primarily guilds geared towards the training of the clergy. Right, so geared towards a certain kind of monastic ecclesiastical training, right? So they did not work with a consciousness of institutionality. And that is what I really want to also then come to, right? So in the case of India, because I trace in the book that the university as an idea enters India only through the colonial archive. And of course, thanks to the colonial state apparatus, right? So it is through the colonial archive that the idea of the university as an institution enters India, right? So the centers for learning that we had before did not work with a consciousness of what I call a corporative community, of being one in terms of the practices of learning, right? So of a certain kind of an embodied sense of a community. Right, so, and that history would have really borne out, I think, if I were to trace that kind of a medieval to modern kind of transition, and that would have, so thanks to Chetna for actually pointing this out, and I think the kind of pitting of the university that I'm trying to make in saying that the idea of the Indian university is a borrowed idea, is a loaned idea, right? So that it owes to a certain colonial archive would have really borne out if I were to actually look at the transition and the transformation of the medieval universitas into the modern university, which gets set up by, as we all know, the great German philosophers, right? So Humboldt, and of course Humboldt, Schleiermacher, right, so Fichte, right, around the early 19th century. So that is again something that then gets picked up. So thank you so much. The discussion about AMU and BHU, right? So again, so AMU is something that I do take up, right? So the Muslim university is something that I do take up in talking about how in post-independence India, right? So the question of religion is being dealt with vis-a-vis the university and vis-a-vis questions of knowledge. BHU I don't, and I did not again want to get into these, and which also takes on the question of Allahabad University, which I think could have actually been a very interesting example again. Thank you so much for these suggestions, and I really do want to look into these archives. But except that AMU has already had a lot of history written, right? So from David Lelyvel to, let's say, Laurence Gauthier, right? So recently, very recently, right? So BHU too has had some bit of work being done around it. Allahabad, I think, waits to be written about at length, and which is something that I do want to, except that I had very little access. I did mobilize some archives around the state of higher education in Bihar, but UP is a field which again is something that I hadn't quite looked at. But that again would have required me to come to the book with an ethnographic focus, which I, frankly speaking, did not have the competence for, and number two, also I did not want to make the book into, let's say, a hagiography / an ethnography of individual institutions. Though, I mean, I rely on examples from Bengal precisely because that's a field that I have navigated in person and also lived in person to a certain extent. And of course the role of the Indian middle classes, I do touch upon it at a particular moment, but yeah, I think, I mean, all of this, right, I think, I mean, all of Chetna's comments are really important, and thank you so much, Chetna. I don't think I have answers to them. I will take them as comments and take them back to work on my archive and to kind of probably take this further, and I would love to continue conversations with you, particularly again, the final point, the 7th point, as I've noted down, right, from your entire series of comments, which is about the history of the politicization of the office of the Vice Chancellor and how that changes the entire kind of logic of autonomy around the Indian university. Yes, it's a different case, and which is something that we got into, right? So it's a different case that we had nothing called academic freedom, but we did have something called a structural autonomy, despite there being political appointees in the vice chancellors all along, right? So despite there being considerable political influence in the office and through the recruitment of vice chancellors, how is it that we still managed to kind of keep this fig leaf of structural autonomy in place is something that really needs to be written about. Brahm, thank you so much again, right? I think, I mean, the gift of a utopia that the university work comes with, and that this work actually comes out of a certain sense of, what should I say, a certain sense of discomfort with that talk that has happened enough, right? And I think there's a certain kind of liberal enthusiasm around the gift of the utopia that the university comes with, and I keep arguing to myself and questioning myself, and I keep doing it even after writing the book, because I don't think we've quite arrived at an answer. Why is it that the gift of the utopia bombed in the way that it did? Right, so why is it that the utopia has been turned into precisely its opposite? Right, so if the gift of the utopia were just to be sustained, right, so by the fact that the university managed, even if for a shorter period of time than one would imagine the entire length of a student's career to have undergone and inhabited the university, right, so even if for just a brief while, if the utopia really worked, then it should have probably oriented, let's say, the imagination or the imaginative capacities that the university was supposed to be imparting to students in such a way that some of it would have probably delivered us from the complete exact opposite of the utopia that we are living today. And also, I think, yes, as you have said, that this utopia does exist, but this utopia exists to a great extent, and this is again speaking from experience, a great extent it exists only within a certain instantiation of the liberal metropolitan university. Right? So in the non-metropolitan, non-urban university spaces, and a lot of which I've also kind of come out of and gone and taught at, right? So and that's pretty much also what accounts for the writing of the book, right? So I've taught at practically all kinds of public universities that exist on the India's public university map, right? So from, let's say, provincial central universities to, let's say, state government colleges to non-metropolitan state universities, and I've realized that the kind of utopia that a JNU comes with, or the kind of utopia, and I'm saying that JNU, despite, right, so every attempt at trying to also live away from the metropolitan aura of the elite intellectual subject, right? So through the deprivation point system, through the kinds of long struggles, right, for creating a space, even in a metropolitan, let's say, site, right? Creating a space which could be sensitive to a different horizon of student expectations. So JNU, despite that history, right, so still has a certain kind of a liberal metropolitan charm, which if one were to move outside of Delhi, and I'm not speaking of JNU alone, I'm speaking of Delhi University, I'm speaking of even, I think, places like Ambedkar University, Delhi, which is of course fallen on horrid times right now, but of course, all Delhi institutions, right? So to a certain extent, but of course the case of JMI is completely different, right? So, but just the entire discourse of higher education in Delhi allows a certain kind of liberal charm, right? So, and a liberal promise of emancipation, which does not exist the moment one moves out of Delhi, right? So, and it has existed in bits and pieces and in, let's say, rather patchy scraps through different periods in different universities, but those have also largely been through instances of individuals, specific, let's say, vice chancellors, specific administrative regimes trying to bring about a certain kind of a transformative climate in specific non-metropolitan universities. So that's pretty much the ground from which I came to this book, which is that yes, the utopia exists, but does the utopia equally apply to all spaces outside of the universities that we've probably studied in or grown up in? And my own experience tells me that a lot of that utopia also comes mired in a deeply feudal circuit of power and privilege, right? And the moment one moves out of Delhi, one realizes that universities can really be feudal fiefdoms, right? And they have existed as feudal fiefdoms historically, right? Of course, with alternating periods of ebbs and flows, but they have historically existed through certain kinds of community coteries, right? So stratified by questions of caste, gender, and of course religion, right? So religion, ethnicity. But I do take your, I have to take Brahm's very, very kind, right, so kindly framed remonstrance, right, which is that one has to contextualize the position that one is coming to the university with, right, so, and a first generation learner thinking the university of the history is definitely not me, right, so thinking the university of the history, right, so isn't criticality, right, so, or the criticality of the critical history as I call it, also a matter of talim, as it were, right, so, and also a university legacy. So I completely take that on board, and I think it's a very, very crucial kind of prism through which I have to also look at the vantage position from which I come to the university. How to dissociate the materiality from the idea, which was Brahm's question again, right? So, and does one see in the Indian university specifically an embodiment of a paradox, and can we work with that paradox then, right? So, can we work with, let's say, the university being a paradoxical space? I do think that one can, and which is what we have done. Right, so, which is what we have done for the entire length of the Indian university's history, and but it's one thing to to acknowledge that there is a certain paradox at the heart of the university. It's another thing to then let that paradox bear out in the ways that it has, right? And I think what I'm really pained by is the fallout of this paradox, right? So where it seems that what this paradox has eventually bred is not only a history of deep violence, but a complete overturning of the idea of the university to what we see here today, right? So, and therefore, I think at some level, it is important for us to say that, well, we've lived with the paradox and we might as well then see the Indian university as a site of paradoxical contestations, as a site of paradoxical tendencies. But why is it that one part of those tendencies have overtaken the other part? Right, so why is it that the Indian university can then finally come to be inhabited by the mob? Right, so why is it that the same publicness that we wanted the university to be separated from, we wanted the university to be a corrective to public opinion, and therefore our entire spiel about academic freedom was about the university being that space which could go out and correct the excesses of public opinion, except that enlightened position of distance and criticality that we very easily attributed to the work and the role of the university has bombed to such an extent where the public now calls the university into being, right? So and when I say the public, I mean, right, so a majoritarian public, right? So why is it that publicness has bombed in our face? And if publicness has bombed in our face, despite the university trying to maintain its structural autonomy from publics at large, right? So then probably it's important to try and see that have we not really, have we in some way made the university seem like a space that the public cannot or does not ever become relevant within, right? So has we alienated the university from the public to such an extent where the public must now either will the shutdown of the university or inhabit it in the voice of a mob, right? So then it probably is important for us to kind of go back into those secret histories of publicness which the university has for the longest time stayed away from. And which is what takes me to Aditya's, I think, brilliant kind of start, right, so to his discussion about the book, where, and I think, I mean, that is again something that an alternative ethnography of the university could be all about, where the university is not necessarily just a knowledge institution, but the university is also just a public artifact. The university is also a city space, and can we just look at the university as a set of arterial roads? Right, so can we look at the university as just a public monument, right? So, and you spoke about BHU and how BHU becomes the node of an entire form of cultural practice, right? So in Banaras, and can one do an alternative history of the university's relationship with the public, right? So by looking at the university not as an institution, but as, let's say, a public monument, right? So, or by looking at the university as just a public infrastructure, right? So that that publics relate to. I think, I mean, that was terrific again, and that is something that I'm going to actually try and think about, right? So can the university really be desacralized, as it were, right? So by being treated not as a space of intellectual retreat, but as a space of public everydayness, right? So can the university be turned into an everyday object of public negotiations? I think I had to miss a part of Aditya's comments, so I will get back to you, Aditya, on the rest of it. About the questions that came from the audience, I'm sorry if I'm taking too long, but I'll just now quickly, take on. So the fear of So how does the fear of publicness turn into the fear of private intellectual pursuit? That's exactly what I try and show in this book, that it was the fear of publicness that precisely made the university into a space where only private individuals can go out and enjoy, right, the entitlements that are given to them by the history of privilege. Right, and the history of privilege would largely be a history of privilege apportioned across questions of caste and religion. Right, and of course, as we know, right, so the questions of caste and religion can play out in questions of class, gender, region, ethnicity, and all of that. Right, so how it is the people who were entering the space of the university were people who were coming with a history of privilege, right, and then that history of privilege that allowed them to stay away from the corrupting touch of the public is what allowed them a safe haven, a safe refuge for the private pursuit of disinterested study. Right? Now this private pursuit of disinterested study, right, so even as it stayed away from the corrupting touch of the public, became, of course, right, so critical of the state as well. Right, so became critical of, let's say, the corrupting force of public opinion as well. Now, which in a majoritarian public, right, so which in a majoritarian state, right, so which in, let's say, these times of elected authoritarianism, right, so if that critique, no matter how disinterested it is, no matter how it parades as the objective critique of the social sciences, right, so even if that critique comes out of the university at the level of disinterested intellectuality, it becomes a threat to the constitutive force of the people that runs an elected authoritarianism. And which is why then even the private aura of the intellectual becomes a threat to the state. Right, so that is where I thought it becomes a problem here. The second question about university versus center of knowledge, it's a long debate, and of course a part of the debate you yourself have touched on, right, and whether one can trace that same kind of question about whether there is really a university even in the Western context, or they were all centers of learning or centers for knowledge. I tried answering a part of the question by getting into the meaning of the university as a corporative idea. Right, and yes, there were centers of learning even in the Western context, right, and these centers of learning were not universities as we know them now. They were, as I said, largely professional guilds, right, so created for the honing of specific professions, and that was how the medieval universitas, right, played out in the history of Europe. Now, the way you said Indian philosophical systems also worked, right, and that the entire history of, let's say, philosophical traditions or intellectual traditions in India, right, so is a history of argument and counter-argument, is a history of what one can call commentary, tikas, right, so is a history of, let's say, the paksh and the pratipaksh. Right, so now that was not necessarily happening within any kind of institutional space. Right, so the way, and that is also a distinction that I try and make, right, so that intellectual traditions have existed irrespective of institutions becoming the bastions of intellectual forms of inquiry. Right, so and what I'm trying to do here is the role of the institution in becoming, let's say, the guardians or the custodians of intellectual traditions, right? So, which is not to say that intellectual traditions themselves are to be discounted. And there have been centers of learning around intellectual traditions. There have been centers of learning everywhere, right? So this is a question that I want to really kind of engage with you on. So, but I'm just trying to also make a distinction between an intellectual tradition and an institution of knowledge professionals, right? So can we imagine something like an institution of knowledge professionals where the people who enter the space imagine themselves as professionally part of a community, right? So and can that be imagined as just centers of learning, or does that need the thought and the possibility of a university? And which is where the debate is. faculty development program, of course, I mean, again, long history, a lot of course, in the, there's one way in which the colonial archive bears out, right, so about faculty, the quality of faculty, etc. Right, so if one gets into questions of how faculty recruitments were thought of in the colonial university, there is a certain way in which, let's say, quality, merit, etc. are being spoken of there, and how the development of that merit is conceived is something that does not exist that does not really get borne out in colonial archives, but in post-independence policy documents, there is indeed quite some talk of faculty development, right? So, and in fact, the Radhakrishnan Commission report, as well as the Kothari Commission report, right, to dedicate a fair amount of space to how faculty of universities are to be honed and developed, right? So how intellectual capabilities are to be enhanced over time, and of course one can have debates about that, but there is a clear kind of attempt at trying to also imagine the faculty as not just a specialized intellectual, but as a holistic, right, so being, and that is how faculty development has. And that is, I think, also interesting for us to note how it has now been interpreted, come to be interpreted today, right? So where holistic individuality is about a little bit of Saraswati Vandana, right? So with a little bit of talk on nanotechnology, right? So where, so it is, but the emphasis on holistic personality development as the promise of faculty development courses is something that exists all the way from, let's say, the late 1940s, right? So from the Radhakrishnan Commission report, which is the immediate post-independence period, right? So, and there is, and I think that could be a very, very important archive to then trace the history of personality, right, within, and so if one can do a history of the cult of personality vis-a-vis the growth of the university, I think that could be a very, very important kind of peg and handle on it. The fourth and the final question, right, so the rise of the private university and whether the ideal university as an egalitarian space can be imagined as a private university, I think, I mean, the easy answer would be no, right, so, and I'm not saying no because I'm ideologically ranged against the private university, which I am, right? So I'm absolutely ideologically against the idea of a private university, right? So, and but I'm not saying no because of that, right? So I'm saying no from the way in which private universities have also borne out an experience, right? So we have had an Ali Khan Mahmudabad, right? So happening just about, right? So, couple of months ago, less than a couple of months ago. We have the case going on even now there's only a stay order, right, so but the case is being tracked, right, so we've had, right, private universities from Ashoka to Jindal to and the other private universities, less said the better, right, so but of course even the elite liberal arts private universities we have seen, right, so how egalitarianism plays out. But what is important, and I think it's an important question to be taken on board, what is important for us to note is that the way in which private universities actually mine the logic of freedom, right, so in a time when the public university has by default become synonymous with illiberalism, right, so at a time when the public university is equal to the liberal university, we have given the platter, I mean, we've given it on a platter to the private university to become the bastion of freedom, and which is why private universities can peddle themselves as liberal arts universities, right? So can peddle themselves as training people in the practice of freedom, irrespective of the fact that the fee structures that these universities come with, right, to almost discount the need for freedom in the students who enter those universities, right? So that is a different debate. But of course, I mean, you can then say, but Ashoka has waivers, right? So that is again a question of yes, of course, Ashoka has waivers, right? So yes, of course, private universities come up with this liberal conscience policy, right? So, but how do you determine waivers, right? So do you leave it to the conscience of the institution, or do you leave it, right? So, or do you, what has been achieved through, let's say, something called affirmative action, through a reservation policy, do you leave it to certain kinds of material determinants of what we call need and a certain kind of accounting of historical injustice through not just immediate material need, but histories of need that then translate into histories of merit? Right? So how does one account for it? Right? So in leaving it to, let's say, a conscience of the institution model of doing it, which is what private universities do. So I think, there is a certain kind of a staging of a contradiction, right? So that happens at private universities through their tom-tomming of the ideal of freedom, which I think is fundamentally opposed to the idea of the public university. But sadly, that is also a space that is given to the private university, because public universities by default have become illiberal spaces. So thank you. I have to thank all of you for all the questions. Thank you so much.
And thank you, Debaditya. Thank you, everyone. JNU Academic Forum. If you want to say something, yeah.
My name is Saddam Hussain. I am Center for Policy Secondary student. So before giving vote of thanks, I just want to raise one point here. This seminar, this JNU academic session is holds so much relevance right now. As the discussant right now described that how it, because we are at the time of the university where everything is being down. Recently, one of our youngest faculty was terminated by VC, which is, so I guess you guys can make sense. So as we come to the close of this enriching book discussion, it is my honor to extend a heartfelt vote of thanks to all those who have contributed to making this event a success. First and foremost, our deepest gratitude to Dr. Debaditya Bhattacharya and the esteemed editors of the book for sharing profound insights and scholarship with us today. A special thanks to Dr. Brahma, Prakash and Dr. Chetna, Trivedi and Aditya for their thought-provoking contribution and carrying the discussion with such depth and thoughtfulness. To our wonderful audience, thank you for the presence, your questions and your engagement. Your participation has made this discussion all the more meaningful, turning it into an interactive and insightful dialogue. We are especially grateful to the chairperson of the Center for Informal Sector and Labour Studies and to the Dean of School of Society for making this space available and supporting such initiative in a time where the broader space for democratic deliberation is steadily shrinking. The gesture reaffirms the university's role as a site of open inquiry and critical thought. With that, we conclude today's discussion. Thank you once again, and we look forward to many more such conversations in the future. There's a tea and samosa waiting for us outside. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you.
टाइम निकालता है
हाँ